Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
Justin, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, and we have a lot of different guests on, and I think per the name of the show, the main focus is on agencies, but I love getting people from other walks of life. You kind of coming from a productized services background, I think it's really useful to kind of like broad frame this journey of ours and the value drivers and basically getting like other ideas. So with that, would you mind talking a bit about your background and kind of how you started Video Husky and so on?
Yeah. Okay. Wait. So before we go there, just so I know, what's the difference in your mind between an agency and a productized service? Because I hear this is different for every person.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I guess I associate an agency with a more complex service that requires maybe more cooks in the kitchen, maybe a longer sales process. It's less repeatable and so on. There's probably a few other things, but that's what comes to mind, I guess.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's interesting because I know there are definitely aspects of a productized service where you think like it rolls smoothly, it's completely flat. But yeah, even on the back end, there's always going to be something happening one way or another. But yeah, I can give a bit of an explanation for Video Husky. We started back in 2018. And at the time, I was running Facebook ads for local businesses in Hong Kong, where I grew up. And just that was when Facebook ads video format became super popular. And there was, at least for me, no easy way to get videos edited in an easy, straightforward manner. You know, you have to get the quote, you have to negotiate, it's just a pain. And it was around that time that I came across Design Pickle by Russ Perry. And I thought, oh, maybe there's a way to build this model, but for video editing. And that's when it started.
Yeah. And going back to your question, I guess, like, how do you differentiate between an agency and a productized service model, and what comes to mind for you?
So that for me was the transition, because I guess when I ran Facebook ads, it was a one-man agency, if you get to call that an agency, but like you said, a longer sales process. But I think also being more involved in the other companies' workflow. It's like you show up on their schedule, you show up, you respond to their emails in a timely manner. Versus, I guess, when I used Design Pickle for a couple of months, and I was like, oh, wait a second, this is even better. There's no meetings, there's no customization. And even though there are times where I felt the urge that I wanted that as a customer, the ultimate result that we didn't use that time led to a better result, if that makes sense. And so I really wanted to take that and apply it to video.
Right. And I think that that's the tough nut to crack, right? Because like there's a lot of lucrative demands to customize, and that's obviously what agencies do. And then I think to build a good productized service, it sounds like you have to be, you have to work hard enough to validate it and then be disciplined enough to keep that structure or change it only when it's absolutely necessary. But to get into that, or kind of preempting maybe what you would talk about, can you talk about those first, at Video Husky, like how did you validate it? What did the initial offer look like?
Yeah, for sure. So the initial offer was pretty simple. I just took everything Design Pickle did, and I was like, we'll apply it straightforward. They did $370 a month at the time. It's way more expensive now for unlimited request graphic design. So I said video editing is more complicated, so let's go $495. You get unlimited requests, you get a revision back every 1 to 2 business days, and just put up a landing page. And then I talked to some of my existing clients and said, hey, I'm going to sign you guys up to this if you're interested. They all said yes, and that was the starting point. But of course, within, call it 2 months after we had created all the videos they needed, they churned out. And so that was, I think, the initial spark, and then the initial kind of crash.
Yeah. And what did you do next? Let me just leave it at that.
So in my mind, I thought, okay, I'm going to give it 3 months to get 10 customers, which if I were to go back and do that now, in some ways, it's like 3 months is like both too long and too little. But by, I think, day 85, we only had 4 customers. So I thought, oh, this is really going in the bin. But what made a difference for me was being a part of the Dynamite Circle. So just a community of location independent entrepreneurs, and posting about the journey kind of as I was going. And eventually somebody who was a YouTuber posted and said, oh, wait a second, this is exactly what I was looking for, because she posted right underneath my thread. A lot of other YouTubers also looked at it. And then within that last 4 days, we got 6 more clients and got me to that magic 10 mark that I had set for myself in Video Husky.
That makes sense. And I guess what like, how did you progress the offer? Because you mentioned this issue where, you'd have kind of it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, like a project-based model. Did you maintain that model, and what did the journey look like to kind of optimize things?
Yeah, so up till now, the model is that original package is still there. It is much more expensive than it used to be. I think now it's around 750 as opposed to 495. And so over time, of course, you realize you can't just be the cheapest option. There's a reason why that doesn't quite work out for the most part. And the reality is most people are willing to pay a little bit more, 25% more for the whole package versus if you are offering the bare bones. Well, most people just end up being unhappy with the work. And so while we have that package up to now, we were able to over time also develop a slightly lower end package, originally just for kind of like people who needed a part, like a quarter time editor, as we used to call it, which evolved into a package just for people who needed to do shorts. And then now we have a general manager in place who developed two higher tier packages that even I don't understand, because he comes from a more agency background, ironically, and that's just kind of out of my wheelhouse.
And let's talk about that a little bit. So, how did you decide where to focus this? If you niched it, how did you niche it? Because when you think about video editing, you think about something that's commoditized that, you could go on Upwork, get a freelancer. How did you go about to kind of differentiating the offer?
In the beginning, like the first year, 2 years, we barely niched. The only thing that we refused to do was wedding videos, just because they needed a really fast turnaround on that, typically within the same day. And so I imagine there is some business out there if you wanted to do some kind of outsourced video, wedding video, that's 100% possible, but it didn't suit us. But I'll say that we didn't niche down fast enough or early enough. And I think it's one of the things that we realized over after 2 years where we collectively tried to always bring in more customers. It turned out that the top 20% of our customers actually brought something like 70% of all of our lifetime revenue and 250% of our profit over that time.
That's something that I hear a lot of, and I guess I've had kind of minor revelations like that too in our business, where you just kind of like look at these numbers, and they're usually not the most complicated numbers, but it takes having things kind of set up in a clean way, like the table being set the right way, to finally see them. I guess, like, what did it take for you to finally have that click, and like, why do you think it took longer than it could have?
I think a lot of it comes down to like first time running, in my mind, what is a bigger business, right? Because it was like the first time that we scaled to seven. I built a business that scaled to 7 figures, and I was all excited about that. And I just kept thinking more and more customers is the way to go. And as you see the number going up and to the right, I didn't think about churn. All I thought about was like number of active customers. For me, a new customer is the same as an old customer. Who cares? But the reality is an existing customer matters a lot more, because not only is it much harder to sell to a new customer, which I found out much later on, the reality is that existing customer also brings in referrals. And so what was the turning point for me was actually COVID, when we lost a bunch of business and we started working with a new bookkeeper, and they kind of outlined what a healthy business should look like. And we broke out our customer groups, and I realized, oh, there are certain segments that we are completely not only unprofitable for, our staff hate working for, and was a prime reason for why some of our staff chose to leave, because it was so difficult working with certain customer segments.
Yeah, and I think you have this great blog post kind of like documenting the history of the company, and you talk about an angry team Zoom call from 2019. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so this again goes back to, I think, a lot of naivety over my part as a business owner. I'd never run such a big team. And so the first 2 years of the business was grow at all costs. Let's get it to 7 figures, because there was like an ego thing behind it. And while that's great, there are definitely costs to growing that quickly. For one, there was no profit. The other was I had run our team pretty hard. And especially not knowing how do you set up the right HR structures? How do you bring somebody on? How do you assign work properly? I had inevitably kind of burnt our team out. And this came to a head, I guess, when we were setting Christmas break policies in 2019, because at that point we had a policy where, oh, you can take leave whenever you want, because that's what I personally, as a then digital nomad, liked. I didn't want to take public holidays at the same time that anybody else took them. I assumed that all of our staff would want the same thing. Turned out they all wanted to take it over Christmas, and we hadn't budgeted for that. And so when we had over half the company say we're going to take leave over Christmas, we didn't have enough buffer editors to keep on working over that period of time. I said, no, we can't have this many people take leave, and started denying leaves. And that's when a lot of our editors were quite unhappy with my own decision. And it was kind of like floated back up to me because we had so many editors at the time. I couldn't speak with everyone individually, that this was a huge issue. And so that was kind of like one of our big challenges when growing the company.
Yeah. Around how many team members did you have at this point? Like what did the management structure look like, the org chart, et cetera?
Oh, at that point, then we had like 40 something editors. We had 6 or 7 kind of like middle management project managers who managed like a group. And then all of those reported to one more ops manager. And so that was kind of the structure.
Right. That makes sense. And what did you do about it? Like what did you learn from it? How did you rectify it, et cetera?
So after a lot of discussions with individual pods, as we called them, just to kind of get a better understanding, we came to the decision that during that week, we would take 5 days off. And then if you include the weekend before, weekend after, it's a full 9-day break. And that would just be it. And I would announce it to all of our customers that this was a new thing we were testing. And in my mind, I was like, we're going to lose half our customers because you can just go and decide to not be active for a full quarter of a month. People are going to want refunds. People are going to want, days back. And some did, but the majority were actually quite happy to hear that our editors would get a break. The majority of them said, we have no work during this time anyway. And so, yeah, we'll look forward to getting started again in January. And that was kind of a really big perspective shifting moment for me.
What was that perspective? Is it basically that the thing that you're worried about asking from your customers usually isn't as bad as you think it is? Or what other lessons did you learn from that?
That I don't actually know what the customer wants. I think that was the biggest one. And because most of them were okay with it, and it was no issue. But I was so insistent that I knew what a customer would want, that I went and imposed that onto our team of like 40, 50 people without actually verifying that I think it was probably the first time that I realized, oh, I'm not all seeing, all knowing, as dumb as that sounds. But yeah, I think that was the first time emotionally that I understood that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's kind of like nonstop humility when it comes to that. There's so many little surprises, even when you get to know a niche really well. And I think that's another argument to niche, where to go back to the earlier question where we talked about, like, you found out basically that there's this Pareto thing going on, right? Where you're like 80% of the revenue for 20% of the clients. What did that niche look like to you? How did you define it?
So for us, yeah, kind of like the combination of the two factors made us say, okay, let's try to find a way to run this business a bit better. And it came down to a combination of who are the most profitable customers and who are the customers our team enjoyed working with most. So it was like, if you imagine a Venn diagram, we want to find the group of people kind of in between. And what we realized was our customer group was something like 30% content creators, 30% small business owners, 30% agencies, which is not great in terms of a breakdown. We couldn't really split the difference at the time between small business owners and creators. But what we did know was we didn't want to work with agencies as a kind of like semi-white label option anymore. And so we dropped that. Not immediately, but we stopped bringing on new agencies over time. We let go of a lot of our existing agencies. And that, as we kind of ran the numbers, we could see over a 6-month period that, our LTV would go up. Our staff were happier. And that was, I wish we could have niched down even more in some ways. That for us was already a really good starting point. And while our marketing continued to focus mostly on content creators, we still work with some small businesses today.
Got it. That makes sense. And that doesn't surprise me because, it seems like the complexity is a lot higher when you have more cooks in the kitchen with a white label, where you'd have the agency and then the buffer to the end client and so on from there. But correct me if I'm wrong. And I guess with that in mind, like, what did it take to maintain the so-called productized structure? Did you have demands to customize more that you had to sort of like have discipline to fend off? Or what did that process look like to sort of evolve the offer over time?
So I think this is one of those situations where it really depends on how active you are as a founder. And this is one of, I think, my own weaknesses as a entrepreneur, founder, whatever. Looking back, now I know all I wanted was to build a business where I was not involved, or I was minimally involved. And therefore, I did not speak to our customers that much. Versus, let's say, a very good or very committed founder or entrepreneur or operator would be in front of customers every single day, if not every week. And they would have been able to unearth those demands. Because I was never in front of a lot of our customers, I was only ever on damage control. I didn't know what the demands were actually. And so I would at best know after like multiple editors told their project manager and it got floated up. But by that point, it's already third hand versus a very strong entrepreneur would have found those out in the first place. And I think that was until now, still was my biggest challenge as an entrepreneur.
Yeah. And I also think it's more challenging when I guess like when what you do is more narrow and there's a lot more customers to talk to, right? Because there's a lot more noise to deal with than if you are an agency and you've got like 10, 15 clients at a time, right? So it's a different sort of process. And that's something I think about with a productized service that's kind of in the middle. I guess just to give context, like where you guys are, you don't have to, get into exact numbers, but roughly how many clients do you guys have at any given time that you're working on?
150, something like that.
Right. That makes sense. So it's a different process for getting that feedback, and there's surveys and all that's kind of a good place to go with this, maybe, now that I'm thinking out loud and rambling. What have you found to work really well for getting that sort of feedback and actually find out what's going on now that you've kind of addressed that area of improvement?
In many ways, I actually haven't been able to address that area of improvement. For me, the solution was actually bringing on a general manager. And since 2021, he has been the one who has been captaining the ship. And while like we meet and we talk on a regular basis and we don't completely see like eye to eye on every single little thing, I have to say one thing that I do admire a lot about our GM is he has a certain intensity and drive that is represented when he speaks to our customers, and he's able to then develop new products as a result of that. So it wasn't so much I solved the problem by improving. It was more I said I just can't see myself being more involved, and so bringing somebody else in was much more helpful.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's take a step back. How did you decide to do that? Like, was there a moment? Like, what did it take for you to decide that you're going to step away and bring in somebody else?
So the moment I think was around halfway through 2021. So that was like a year and a half after COVID. I think that was like 18 months of firefighting. During that time, we lost 30% of our business, doubled it again, got profitable, built up a good amount of cash in the bank. So we didn't have that same panicky feeling. But around kind of mid 2021, that's when I realized, okay, I'm like around 3.5 years into this, almost 4. I just couldn't see myself doing this for the next 3, 5, 10 years. And it just came down to a lack of two things, which, like, speaking to more founders, I think you kind of realize it. I had a certain lack of founder market fit and also a certain lack of like founder role fit within the company. And that second one is what I was alluding to. It's like at that level, you should be speaking to your customers all the time. I didn't have it in me to do that. I hate the word, but authentically.
That's super interesting because we hear a lot about product market fit, obviously. Can you elaborate a little more on that? Like how do you think of founder market fit, and what were those gaps for you beyond that?
So the best kind of definition of founder market fit, I think, was from Taylor Pearson. And his thing is like, could you see yourself having lunch with one of your customers every Friday? And realistically, I just couldn't. I think back when Video Husky served a lot more small business owners or even agency owners, I related to them a lot more. I understand the metrics, I understand the numbers, I understand the game. As we kind of shifted our focus more towards content creators, especially video content creators, I am not a fan of getting in front of a camera. I don't understand the metrics. I don't understand organic. I don't understand YouTube. And I'm impressed, but when people are able to create amazing content, but I don't resonate on a forget deep level, just on a certain level. And so, because I don't resonate, I can't see video from the same perspective as our customers. I can't understand the certain nuances that make for a good video. And therefore, I can't apply those insights, those non-insights, since I don't have them, to Video Husky. Even little things such as like the details of, I remember one guy I was talking to, he ran a video podcast. And it was like, if you have a really good video podcast editor, they're able to cut out the breaths of each podcast host and speaker. And I'm like, wow, you know what? That's like so far beyond me. But you know what? Like that's what it takes to do good work, right? But I can't relate to that. That's not something that I guess I get excited about.
Yeah, that's funny. And thank God for our producers. I'll plug them, Glotty Media, that make me sound much more direct and eloquent that I am. So definitely appreciate the magic that goes into editing across the board. That's interesting, because I think that if you were to say in certain, it could be dynamite circles, certain peer groups, whatever it is, hey, I don't think I'm the best founder for my market, you would get advice that's like, great, hire whatever, a head of client accounts, a salesperson, just hire other people to kind of handle the front lines of that and so on. But it sounds like you made the decision to hire out everything, a general manager, kind of a new captain of the ship, as you say. And it sounds like it was the right decision, with the feedback that you've gotten so far. But how did you decide to go that route? Were there other options that you saw? And yeah, how did you land on that?
Yeah. So the way I landed on it was I was working with Taylor Pearson at the time, a business coach.
Who I've also
Taylor
worked with and know very well, good friends. So
Oh, cool.
plug
Okay.
Taylor, yeah.
Yeah, huge fan of his stuff. And he just kind of outlined to me like these are like the options that you have from his experience of working with clients. Either you can find a role within your company that you enjoy doing and keep on doing that, which yeah, there are one or two roles, but I wasn't excited about that. Option two was to sell, which I mean, if I'd sold in 2021, then you probably get a great multiple, less so now. But that was also not quite appealing. I wasn't ready to let go. Or three is to hire a general manager to run the entire thing, or at very minimum, like a director of operations.
So why wasn't door number one that appealing? Like, could you have had a separate sector that's like the customized agency sector of the business? Did you think about that at all? Or was it pretty much that wasn't viable, like course creators are our new market, et cetera?
So door number one wasn't viable because I think like this is about knowing each person's personality. It's like I didn't want to spend any more time working within this space or working within the role. This kind of goes back to the market founder and founder role fit. Neither appealed to me. And so I couldn't find no matter like what role I didn't vibe with our customers, so I didn't think I should do it. And I couldn't find a role within the company that I was excited about. So given we were such a people heavy company and I myself am an introvert, I decided I couldn't see that being a viable option. I wanted to try something new. I wanted to explore, which to be fair, 2 years later, not much has happened. But at the time, it was something I wanted to go off in a different direction. As far as door number two, I mean, if you're able to sell for like, I think there were companies at the time going for 6-7x SDE. Maybe if we had sold, I would have been open to that. But if you like for standard agency is like you typically get 3-4 times, that's not all that exciting. But I think for me, I didn't want the huge identity loss of selling a company, because like you go from like, I don't know, like thinking about a company like 160 hours a week to nothing. That for me was too jarring. I wanted a more transitional step. And so that led to door number three, which is bring on a GM, minimal time and energy investment. At worst, you have to step back in 6 months later, but at least you have a 6-month sabbatical. At best, you make your company more valuable because you are no longer a keystone while you can enjoy dividends out of the company. And because you want to enjoy dividends out of the company, you also have to professionalize it and standardize it a little bit more.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sort of speaking in the mind of a lot of our listeners that are like, hey, I've been running this agency. We've got 10, 20 clients, they're investing big money in us. I have a personal relationship with all of them, but this sounds pretty appealing to me. Like I'd love to get a GM to kind of do everything and be in the background a little bit more for whatever reason. How viable do you think that is? Do you think that you being able to make this relationship successful with the GM was kind of predicated on having a very productized business, or is that just head trash? Like what's your take on that?
I would love to say that's the case, but I'm sure Fed would not say that's the case, because when he stepped in, whether it's productized or not, I mean, you could be running a SaaS. There are always going to be things that you have to deal with: clients, emergencies, fires, staff leaving. And so it would still work for an agency model, I think. But what is, especially once you kind of get over 7 figures, right? You start to have that kind of budget. And so what it does require is for you to take a pay cut, right? Because let's say you have, call it $1 million business with 20% net margins. And if you're able to pay yourself, I don't know, 100 grand as the founder or like the chief operator or general manager of the business, that predicates you, let's say, taking that 100 grand and giving it to somebody else. And so you have to take a 33% pay cut. And you have to ask yourself whether or not you are okay with that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, assuming it actually pans out. And I guess it feels like a risky decision until it does.
Let's face it, Building proposals is a pain for most agencies. It drains your time and energy, and the fear of putting in all that effort only to be ghosted by prospects is real. But what if I told you there's a better way? Introducing Smart Pricing Table, the game-changing interactive proposal software designed specifically for agencies like yours. Developed by a former agency owner, their powerful tool cuts down on the back and forth, incorporates upsells seamlessly, and lets you build proposals at lightning speed. No more grinding it out and leaving money on the table. It's time to create a repeatable system where your prospects can upsell themselves. Learn more at smartpricingtable.com/DAG and schedule a demo today.
So with that, can you talk a little bit about how did you find your GM? Like, how did you find somebody with that sort of resume and that drive to take on a pretty entrepreneurial role, like within an existing company?
Yeah. Before we get there, just like a quick note on that particular part. It sounds easy in some ways, but like having spoken to like, I don't know, like work with a bunch of people, help them kind of go through the same journey. It's much more of an emotional one than people give credit for, because it really, the hardest part isn't hiring somebody. The hardest part is emotionally letting go. But I think especially at 7-figure scale, let's say you reach your first million, 2 million, whatever. So even if you wanted to get to like 5 or 10, at some point you have to let go. Then you have to sacrifice a certain amount of margin, even though, let's say you spent 5 years getting there. It's like you have to make the choice of, oh, I finally get to live it up a little bit, or I get to double down by hiring somebody else, either to free yourself up or to grow further. I think that's a decision that most 7-figure entrepreneurs leave way too long, because whatever gets you to the next step, whether to step out or to grow the company, is you're going to need to bring on more experienced people. You can't keep on promoting people from within, because every time you promote somebody, they become less and less qualified. And the decisions they make have larger consequences. And so you really want experienced people to come in and play that role externally as opposed to internally, I think. Sorry for cutting you off, but that was an important note, I think.
No, that's a really good point. I'm glad you made it. And what is that? The Peter principle is everybody rises to their zone of incompetence, which sounds so dark and sounds so negative, but it's true, I think. So no, that makes a lot of sense. And was that something that you knew when you made that decision to hire the GM, or is that something you've learned in hindsight?
For the GM specifically, I knew I wanted somebody externally because I didn't see anybody within the company at the time who had the experience. We were a relatively young company at the time. Everybody was under 30. And I wanted somebody else who had been there and done that to be able to take reins and provide that level of confidence. Because it's like one of those things where it's like what gets you here won't get you there. And I wanted a fresh perspective. I didn't want a continuation of what we were already doing. And so that's kind of where Fed came in. Yeah. And we can talk about him and like his role a little bit more, but that was a key driving force, I think.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about it's not like you're hiring a role like a salesperson or whatever. You're hiring like the role, like you're hiring yourself. So how did you plan for that? Like, were you interviewing? Like, how many people did you have to go through to find a fit, and what was that journey like?
Yeah, so it took about 4 or 5 months to find those. So, and from what I understand now, that's relatively quick to find somebody of that role for that caliber. And I was working with Dynamite Jobs recruiting. I think they're now remote first recruiting to help find candidates and source somebody who was good.
We'll plug them too. They're paying us nothing, but we've used Dynamite Jobs. They're great.
Yeah.
Recruiting. So anyway, give them a little plug.
Yeah. So yeah, their recruiting service, they spoke to a bunch of people. I ultimately spoke to 4 people, and Fed was the one who I referred him also internally to our team. He did well in that interview, did well in my interview. His referral interview went well. And so that was kind of how the whole process went.
How did you identify somebody with the kind of the right experience and incentives? Because it's like, it's such an entrepreneurial role where you're basically like, hey, you're going to step into this. You're going to be coming up with products. You're going to be essentially like helping the team grow from seven figures to 8 or beyond, or whatever it is you're trying to do. So how did you find somebody that had what it takes to do that, but who is still interested in working for you in an existing company, as opposed to just like starting their own thing or something like that?
I think there's a couple of things, right? The first is, at least from my side, I wanted somebody who had worked at a similar company and who enjoyed working with our target market, because that's something that I didn't like and would enjoy the role that I didn't enjoy playing. Going back to the market founder and founder role fit. With Fed, he previously worked at a influencer marketing agency. And so a lot of influencers are content creators. So he understood the space, and he had worked in the industry for over a decade. He understood the space well. He enjoyed working with that group of people. So that was a really positive sign for me. His previous agency was bigger than Video Huskies, so also a good sign, although funded as opposed to bootstrapped. So a little bit different, but still for me, that was fine. And as far as like the experience goes, you're right. It's not easy to find somebody who kind of matches up perfectly. But with Fed, when we talked about it, when I understood why there were certain aspects of his previous role that he didn't enjoy, that for me was a good indicator, because he said one of the things was he wanted more autonomy to make decisions. He wanted to be able to implement certain things his way. And I wanted to step away. And so a negative of his previous role became a positive in his current role, I think. And so that was how I started to gauge it.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because it's like there's a lot of potential red flags in interviews, but there's also these kind of green flags where you like light up and you're like, that's a good signal that somebody's entrepreneurial, and so on, is that they're actually like, yeah, the negative sort of becomes a positive. So that makes a lot of sense. And then what was the feedback loop like on that? Like, when did you know it was working? How has it been panning out since then?
So it did take a while. Oh, I realized I didn't answer one of your previous questions. Like, why would somebody work at a company versus starting up something themselves? And I think like having been out of the entrepreneurial, having not started anything recently, it's like, and start like thinking about how you would go about doing that. The reality is like, to start anything, it's like you have 5% chance of succeeding. It's like, just because you did it once before doesn't mean you do it again. And I think especially once you, like, now that I have a dog, at least I can appreciate, it's like once you have more responsibility, your expenses stack up, you are less willing to take that risk of starting something, right? Because that takes a 2-3 year investment. But if you're able to take over something that is already established, that already ranks, that has a presence, you get paid at the same time with opportunity for upside depending on your performance. Even in my shoes as a founder, I think I would rather take that at this point than the risk of starting something new. It's like that book, Buy Then Build. While I personally wouldn't choose to buy a business at this very moment because of how high interest rates are, I think there is something to that. It's like the hardest part really is the beginning, versus if you're able to jump into something that's already a little bit established and take it to the next step, you have a lot more leverage. It's much more within your control. And I think that's something that's worth emphasizing.
Yeah. And I think also as entrepreneurs, like we take for granted how hard it is to start things, because we're like, oh, I'll just do the same thing I did again, but I'll do it over here in a slightly different way and it'll work out. But it often doesn't. So I think that's a really good point. That's interesting. And then to shift gears a little bit, like since you've hired the GM, how is the offer progressing? And to give context, we've had a number of different entrepreneurs on the show that have started productized services. And it seems like the trend I'm seeing is sort of deproductizing and like kind of the trend towards more customization. And we've seen SaaS companies sort of become productized services, and we've seen productized services become like just unbundled. And do you see that as a trend? Like, do you think that's something that's happening? And how do you see something like that affecting you guys, if at all?
Yeah. So over the last 2 years, that's definitely the direction that Fed has taken it. I think number one, because of his own more agency background, but number two, and I think this goes with understanding the marketplace. If you want to charge higher prices, it has to be more customized. It's not going to be productized, because the higher you charge, like the more you want to charge, the more value you have to drive, and the more specific to each individual company. So he came up with 2 higher tier packages, which I think one of them is like 1,700. Another one is like, it depends on what the customer wants. And so 1,700 a month compared to what I originally charged, which was 500. So you can see it's a pretty big jump. And I think that's a much better direction to take it in. Ultimately, a business is better if you have fewer clients at higher margins. And so that's a direction that I know Fed has taken in. I think it is a trend, and I think it's also a good one overall. It means that you end up working with more serious clients as well. Let's say somebody who does video editing for $750 a month. They may be a hobbyist. They may be early 6-figure entrepreneur. All it takes is one bad month and they'll cancel on us. Versus somebody who's paying $1,700 for video editing. They're probably a multiple 6-figure, if not 7-figure business. And so it would take more than just a little bump in the road for them to stop. And that means we can invest in the client, deliver better results. And so it's a direction that I think is definitely happening, and one that I'm glad Fed is implementing. And it's his vision. So I think he's done a really good job with that so far.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you think it's kind of like a macro trend because there's only do you think it's based on like competitive forces? So you have this like pool of people that are a good fit for the super productized side, but then like as more and more options get presented to them, then you're kind of in a position of having to charge more, have fewer clients and that sort of thing. Or like if not, then what forces do you think are kind of impacting that?
I think two forces, macro trends are definitely a thing. I think everybody in the business world has realized that in the last 3 years. But yeah, like in a world where money is cheap and everybody can borrow money to try to make it big as a content creator or whatever, yeah, no big deal. You pay $500, $600, $700 a month. In a world where there is less money flowing around, like today, relative to the last 10 years at least, people are much more fearful of invest or cautious, maybe is a better word, of investing in something that they don't know what the payout is on the other end. And so I think that's one factor. The other factor is, I mean, product as service businesses like these, especially because of COVID, number one, they were always easy to start. But COVID bringing on a lot more people into the remote world meant a lot more people were interested in starting these kinds of businesses. So from a customer perspective, what used to be a blue ocean now is a much redder ocean. And it was always going to get there, but I think it got there much quicker over the last 3-4 years than it would have otherwise.
Yeah, same goes for the agency business. Same goes for lots of businesses. Pretty much anything that you could start with a laptop and an internet connection. So I think that's a great point. So you've stepped out of the business. What now? Is it everything you'd hope to be?
Yeah. So I mean, for like I don't know, like it's about 2 years sabbatical so far. I've done 1 year of full travel with my girlfriend. That was great. We moved to New Zealand, settled down. I've done some coaching now, done some consulting. Coaching, I realized lost my thing. It's cool, but I just can't quite. It's not quite enough for me. Consulting, where I'm more involved in somebody else's company, being able to not be like a full-time staffer, but at the same time getting to do certain things, put let's say 10 hours a week into a company and get a certain amount of autonomy to get the ball rolling on things. That seems to be a potential better fit. So I have no real valid ideas right now. So I've been doing that for the past couple of months, and it's been going pretty well, at least on my side, I think. So I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that sounds like a great place to be. So Justin, this has been a lot of fun. It's great getting your respect on all these things, all things entrepreneurship. Where can people go to see what you're up to, learn about consulting, etc.?
Yeah, for sure. For Video Husky, videohusky.com. For me, it's justintan.me. And I'm also on Twitter. Like, do we still call it Twitter? I don't.
X now. Yeah.
Yeah, X.
X gonna give it to you.
Yeah, at JT, the number 7TH.
Awesome. We'll get that linked up. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure, man. Thanks for having me.